Welcome to Part 12 of Knowledge Targeting, the documentary series from TI1 Voice. This episode is called Directed Energy Weapons, the Non-Lethal Arsenal. Over the next 2 hours, we examine something unusual for this series, a subject where much of the underlying science is not contested at all. It is published, funded, and in some cases fielded. That makes precision more important, not less. So we begin with a document. That sentence describes 3 methods of incapacitation. A voice heard only inside your own skull, a beam that makes a nerve cell fire against its own rhythm, and a slow, directed rise in body temperature toward confusion. It is not community testimony. It is a paraphrase of a real United States Army study, commissioned in 1998, classified for 8 years, and released only after a Freedom of Information request forced it open. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series built by TI1 Voice, a platform where people who believe they are being targeted gather evidence, testimony, and research in one place. Each episode takes one chapter of the community's own literature and reads it slowly, against the public record. We do not tell anyone what is happening to them. We separate what is documented from what is claimed, and we say which is which. This is Part 12 of 50. Part 11 examined a community compilation about satellite-based mind control, a text that built sweeping claims on patents, suggestive institutional names, and a mechanism the document itself called unknown. Part 13 will take the microwave auditory effect on its own terms, the voices in the head problem, in full technical detail. This episode sits between them, and it changes register completely because here the paper trail is real. TI1 Voice lives at 1.witisk.org. It holds an evidence library where members log incidents with timestamps, a knowledge base of several thousand documents, and a community wall. Everything in this episode was drawn from that knowledge base. If you are watching and you have documents, court filings, or technical papers that bear on directed energy weapons, that library is where they belong alongside the records of everyone else. There is also TI-TV, a 24-hour live stream at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TI-TV. It runs interviews, archive material, and these documentaries around the clock. Every episode of Knowledge Targeting also has a written companion article, with the citations laid out so you can check them yourself. If a claim in this episode matters to you, do not take our word for it. Go and read the source. Here is how this episode was assembled. The chapter text is the spine. Around it we ran retrieval across the TI1 Voice knowledge base, pulling passages from the Bradford Non-Lethal Weapons Research Project, a Heritage Foundation study on directed energy for infrastructure defense, a 200-page Naval Postgraduate School bibliography from 2005, and the community's own mind weapon document. Retrieval suggests, it never decides what a slide says. Now the rule that governs every remaining slide. 3 things will be kept apart, always. First, demonstrated and fielded systems, named with their program, their agency, and their year. Second, patents, procurement notices, and research proposals, which prove a filing or a funding line and nothing more. Third, claims that such systems are used covertly against individuals, which are testimony and inference. All 3 are worth discussing. They are not the same thing. A word before we go further, for anyone watching who believes they are being attacked this way. Nothing here is a diagnosis, and nothing here is a verdict on your experience. We are not qualified to tell you what is happening in your home, and we will not try. What we can do is show you exactly where the public evidence is solid, where it thins, and where it stops altogether. The road ahead. We start with the 1998 Army Bioeffects Study, its origin and its release. Then the 7 mechanisms the community calls the second phase arsenal, taken one band at a time. Then the physics that constrains each band: power, range, beam spread, line of sight. Then the systems that were actually built and shown in public. And finally the question that will not resolve neatly, of covert use against individuals. Section 12.1. A real Pentagon study. Everything from here rests on one document, so it is worth being pedantic about what that document is, who wrote it, when, and how it reached the public. Community literature is full of references to secret military research. Most of those references are vague. This one is not. It has a title, a date, an issuing body, and a declassification history you can check. The title is Bioeffects of Selected Non-Lethal Weapons. It was produced under the Department of the Army in February 1998, in coordination with related Air Force work on non-lethal weapons. It stayed classified for 8 years. In December 2006 it was released, not through any official disclosure program, but because a private citizen filed a Freedom of Information Act request and pushed until the Army let it go. What the report contains is a survey of physiological effects from candidate non-lethal technologies, written in flat procedural language. 3 of its entries map onto what targeted individuals describe. Microwave energy producing sound perceived inside the head. Electromagnetic pulses capable of triggering involuntary nerve firing. And directed heating of body tissue. The report is assessing feasibility and hazard. It is not a deployment order, and it names no operational system in use. Reality check, and this is the hinge of the whole episode. The study proves the phenomena are real, were studied with public money, and were thought promising enough to fund. It does not prove that any of them was ever built into a covert weapon, and it does not prove that anyone has been targeted with one. A feasibility study sits a very long way from a fielded device pointed at a home. So what did this research tradition openly produce? The clearest example is the active denial system, developed by the Air Force Research Laboratory with the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate. It projects a millimeter wave beam at 95 gigahertz. It was demonstrated publicly to journalists, mounted on a military vehicle, and shipped to Afghanistan in 2010, where it was withdrawn without ever being used. Documented, named, dated, and photographed in the open. The physics is worth holding onto because it constrains everything. At 95 gigahertz, the energy penetrates roughly 0.4 of a millimeter into the skin. It heats the nerve endings right at the surface and nothing deeper. That is why it hurts and does not burn. It also needs line of sight, a large dish, a vehicle to carry it, and a great deal of power. None of that is subtle. Which brings us to the gap. That a weapon exists is one claim. That it was used on a particular person in a particular house on a particular night is an entirely different claim, needing entirely different evidence. The Department of Defense has consistently denied that directed energy weapons designed for individual targeting exist, and no documented evidence of a miniaturized system has been publicly released. That is where the record currently stands. Section 12.2. The Mind Weapon document names 7 mechanisms as the second phase arsenal, the energy tools that supposedly follow surveillance and human harassment. Extremely low frequency fields, acoustics, harmonics, ultrasound, the microwave audiogram, pulsed microwave, and radio frequency generally, with a subcategory the document calls UHF electromagnetic energy. 7 items presented as one list, as if they were one family. They are not one family, and that flattening is the first thing to undo. The span runs from extremely low frequency, oscillating a few times per second, up to pulsed microwave in the gigahertz range, billions of cycles per second. That is roughly 9 orders of magnitude. Across that span, energy interacts with tissue through genuinely different physics. Electromagnetic fields induce currents in conductive tissue. Acoustic energy moves it mechanically with pressure. Lumping them together hides exactly the differences that decide what is plausible at what range. Take the low end first. Extremely low frequency fields do induce weak currents in tissue. That is real. But at the strengths you meet near power lines or household wiring, they sit orders of magnitude below any documented physiological threshold. The acoustic mechanisms are better understood still from medical ultrasound. The open question is whether any of them can do this covertly at range through a wall. That is where we go next. Those 7 mechanisms give us a map, but they do not give us a source. So we now leave the community's own taxonomy behind and turn to a document that has an address. Section 3 of this chapter examines a single paper, where it came from, who wrote it, when it was written, and how it finally reached daylight. Provenance is not a formality here. In this field, provenance is very nearly the whole argument. In February 1998, researchers working under the United States Department of the Army produced a study titled Bioeffects of Selected Non-Lethal Weapons. The title is deliberately bloodless. It signals a technical document rather than a manifesto or an exposé. The work was produced in coordination with related Air Force research on non-lethal weapons, and it was never intended for public release. For ordinary facts, an author, a date, a purpose, and a classification. This path into public view is the instructive part. It was not leaked by a whistleblower. It was not uncovered by investigative journalism. It was pried loose by a private citizen who was not a public figure or a reporter, and who filed a Freedom of Information Act request about the microwave hearing effect. The process took years. The government resisted. We do not name that person here. The request, not the requester, is the point. Provenance buys you 4 things, and each one closes off an argument. A known author, the Department of the Army. A known date, February 1998. A known audience. People designing weapons, writing for one another rather than for us. And a known release history. Classified, requested, resisted, then released. Every one of those is checkable by a stranger who has no reason at all to trust you. That is what turns a text into evidence. December 2006. 8 years after it was written, the report was declassified. There was no press conference and no official announcement. It surfaced because one person kept asking, and was eventually proved right that the public had a reason to know what its military had been studying. Almost everything the wider community now says about this subject rests, in the end, on that single act of paperwork. Declassification is not endorsement. The stamp on the cover tells you the government no longer considers the content sensitive. It tells you nothing whatever about whether the described effects were ever built. That distinction will matter in every slide that follows. What the release does establish is that these were not fringe preoccupations. They were funded questions asked inside the defense establishment, in the same flat prose used for any other laboratory finding. Journalists covering military technology reported on the contents once they were public. David Hambling, writing for New Scientist and other outlets, described the report in detail, noting that it discussed using lasers to put voices in people's heads. That phrase reads like science fiction. The uncomfortable fact is that the document describing it was real, dated and government-authored, written by people whose job was to judge whether such things could actually be built. Sharon Weinberger, writing for Wired, reported on the wider non-lethal weapons program within which the bioeffects study sat. She described a tension the military never quite resolved, a stated interest in humane weapons set against effects that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to torture, disorientation, involuntary muscle activation, sound heard without any external source. 2 respected technology reporters, 2 mainstream outlets, 1 government document. That is a very different evidential situation from the previous episode. Set the 2 documents side by side. The compilation examined in the previous episode was assembled inside the community from internet sources, bound under a suggestive title, its central mechanism admitted by its own author to be unknown. This one has a government author, a filing date, a release date, and named physical mechanisms. Neither fact makes the second document a proof of covert targeting. It makes it a document you can argue with. So state the limits precisely before anyone else states them for you. The report does not show that any person was targeted. It names no victims, no operations, and no deployments. It is a feasibility study of what the physics permits and what engineering might follow. What it does show is that the phenomena were taken seriously with public money. That is a smaller claim than the community usually makes, and far larger than official silence implies. Now to the first of the effects the report examined, and by a wide margin the best documented of them. It has a name in the open scientific literature, a 1962 paper behind it, a measurable mechanism, and decades of independent replication since. It is taught in bioelectromagnetics courses. It appears in radiofrequency safety standards. It is not a fringe theory, and it is not a community claim. It is the microwave auditory effect. The physics is elegant and, by now, uncontroversial. A short pulse of microwave energy is absorbed by the water-rich tissue of the head. That tissue warms by a microscopic fraction of a degree over a few millionths of a second, and expands. The expansion launches a mechanical pressure wave, a sound wave in effect, which travels to the cochlea of the inner ear. The cochlea cannot tell where a pressure wave came from. The brain hears a click. Alan Fry, an American neuroscientist and biophysicist, first described the effect in 1962 in the Journal of Applied Physiology. The knowledge base records that the work was carried out at Cornell University's General Electric Advanced Electronics Center, under a contract with the United States Navy. Human subjects reported hearing sound when exposed to pulsed microwaves, and the perceived position of that sound tracked the position of the beam relative to the head. The paper trail is long and it is public. A technical report for the Navy in 1961. The journal paper in 1962. Then further publications through the 60s and 70s that refine the mechanism and its parameters. Researchers in the United States, in the Soviet Union and elsewhere confirmed that pulsed microwaves, at particular frequencies and pulse characteristics, reliably produced auditory sensations in human subjects. Independent replication is the part that matters most. Notice carefully what the effect is not. Nothing is transmitted into the mind. No thought is inserted. No meaning is carried. No neuron is read. A pressure wave is made inside the skull, and an ordinary ear does an entirely ordinary job with it. That is also why safety regulators care about it. It demonstrates a real, non-thermal biological consequence of pulsed exposure. Candidate weapon on one desk, public health limit on another. The same paper filed twice. It helps to hold the vocabulary steady, because loose language is where this subject goes wrong. The literature calls it the microwave auditory effect. The community more often calls it the microwave audiogram. Thermoelastic expansion is the mechanism. Pulse width and peak power are the controlling parameters, not average power, which is precisely why the effect can occur well below any heating threshold. That last point is why safety regulators pay attention at all. By 1998, the effect was understood well enough that the Army study could discuss not merely its existence but its tunability. Different pulse characteristics produce different perceived sounds. With sufficient sophistication in modulation, the report suggested, one might produce something closer to intelligible speech than to clicks and buzzes. Now read that carefully. The report did not claim the capability had been achieved. It described a research direction and a design goal. A reality check on what is actually fielded. The active denial system is real, published and repeatedly demonstrated. A millimeter wave beam at 95 gigahertz that penetrates less than half a millimeter of skin and produces intolerable heat without lasting injury. Built under the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate, it was shipped to Afghanistan in 2010 and withdrawn without ever being fired. Large, visible, vehicle-mounted. That is what fielded looks like. Hold three categories apart, because collapsing them is how this subject loses its credibility. First, demonstrated and fielded systems with a program, an agency, and a year. Second, patents, proposals, and procurement notices. A patent proves that somebody filed a description, not that a working device exists. The knowledge base lists a proposed system called Medusa, using pulsed microwaves for auditory effect. Proposed. Reported. Not publicly demonstrated. And third, claims of covert use against individuals. That third category is testimony and inference, not documented deployment, and this series will keep labeling it that way. Hold on to what is genuinely significant. A United States military document in the late 1990s was discussing modulated microwave pulses perceived as speech inside a person's head. That confirms no individual account. It does mean those accounts describe something the defense establishment studied. Next, the second effect. Nanosecond pulses strong enough to make a neuron fire uninvited. The microwave hearing effect is settled science. The second effect cataloged in the 1998 Army report, Bioeffects of Selected Non-Lethal Weapons, is neither settled nor familiar. It does not work by warming tissue at all. It works by driving electrical current straight into nerve cells, forcing them to fire when the brain never gave the order. The underlying physics is ordinary. The engineering is not. Keep those two things apart throughout. Start with the cell itself. A resting neuron holds its interior negative relative to the outside, a gradient maintained by pumps that shift sodium, potassium, and other ions across the membrane. When the cell fires, channels in that membrane open for an instant, ions rush down the gradient, and the membrane depolarizes. That pulse travels the length of the neuron and, at the far end, releases chemical messengers to the next cell in the circuit. So a thought, a movement, a memory is that sequence, repeated across billions of cells in tight coordination. The system is electrical, and that is exactly why it is vulnerable. Anything capable of imposing a strong enough electric field across a membrane can, in principle, open those gates from outside. The neuron has no mechanism for telling an instruction from its own circuit apart from an instruction imposed upon it. That is the whole mechanism. An external electric field, if it is strong enough and oriented correctly, forces those ion channels open directly. It bypasses the cell's own control. What results is an action potential the brain did not initiate, arriving in a circuit that was not expecting it. Nothing exotic is required for this. It is standard electrophysiology, performed in laboratories every day with electrodes, dishes, and slices of tissue. There is a clinical version of this, and it is entirely mainstream. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, holds a coil against the scalp and drives a rapidly changing magnetic field through it. That changing field induces electrical currents in the cortex underneath, which can trigger or suppress neural activity. Neurology clinics use it to map brain function, to treat depression, and to study how the cortex is organized. None of that is in dispute. The 1998 report describes something related but distinct. Not the changing magnetic field of TMS, but the electric field applied directly, in extremely brief pulses. According to reporting on the document, researchers found that pulses of roughly 100 kilovolts per meter, lasting about 1 nanosecond, 1/1,000,000th of a second, could force neurons to fire and disrupt the body's own controlled signaling. That is a very specific engineering claim, precise enough to be checked. Notice what that number does. A field strength and a pulse duration given to engineering precision can be evaluated by anybody holding the relevant physics. You can calculate whether it is achievable at what power across what distance. Vague claims cannot be tested and therefore cannot be refuted. This one can be by anybody willing to do the arithmetic. That is the difference between a document advancing an argument and a document merely asserting one. So, is 100 kilovolts per meter achievable? Yes. It is intense, but it is not remarkable. A lightning strike produces fields far stronger. Laboratory pulse generators routinely reach comparable or higher field strengths across small volumes, and have done so for decades. Nothing in that number strains physics. The difficulty is not making the field. The difficulty, as always in this chapter, is delivering it somewhere useful. That distinction runs through everything that follows. Here is why. Electric fields fall away fast with distance. For the simplest antenna model, field strength drops in proportion to range close in, and faster still further out. A field of 100 kilovolts per meter at 1 meter becomes 10 kilovolts per meter at 10 meters, and 1 kilovolt per meter at 100 meters. That is a 100-fold collapse across a distance you could walk in a minute. And the report, to its credit, does not pretend otherwise. It describes the mechanism. Nanosecond pulses at high field strength can trigger neural firing. It describes the intended effect, incapacitation without killing. It does not describe a weapon achieving that at operational range. Reaching hundreds of meters would demand either an extraordinary source or a focusing method never publicly demonstrated. The document does not claim to have solved that problem. The delivery problem is the oldest problem in this field, and the people working on it have always said so. Writing on electromagnetic anti-personnel weapons, in a report held in our knowledge base, the physicist Jonathan Tenenbaum framed it plainly. Generating an effect is one question. Getting it to a target, intact and at strength, is a different and much harder one. Every claim in this chapter eventually meets that wall. What does it take to generate pulses like these? Large, heavy, power-hungry machinery. Marx generators, pulse-forming lines, and high-power microwave sources such as the virtual cathode oscillator, or Vercator, which our knowledge base notes has been cited repeatedly in directed energy research. These are laboratory and vehicle-scale devices. They are documented, they are real, and none of that documentation shows one operating covertly from an unmarked vehicle against a person who never knew it was there. There is a further consequence the report was candid about. A neuron forced to fire by an outside field fires out of step with the circuit around it. Disrupt enough neurons in one region simultaneously and you approach the uncontrolled, synchronized firing that defines an epileptic seizure. This is not a speculative extrapolation. It is the same risk that TMS researchers manage by strictly limiting intensity and targeting in the clinic. So hold that phrase carefully. A defense research document, written by weapons designers for weapons designers, effectively concedes that the line between incapacitating a person and injuring their nervous system is thinner than the label implies. Our knowledge base records that campaigners have argued such systems should be classed as instruments of torture. That argument remains contested. The engineering candor sitting underneath it is not. Weapons designers said it first in their own technical language. The third effect the report examined is, in physical terms, the simplest of all. Heat the person. According to reporting on the document, researchers discussed raising body temperature to about 41 degrees Celsius, roughly 106 Fahrenheit, several degrees above ordinary fever, as a means of inducing confusion and memory loss. Someone that disoriented cannot perform any task that requires concentration or recall. That was the stated rationale, and the report set it out plainly. The physics here is the least mysterious thing in the entire chapter. It is dielectric heating. An alternating electromagnetic field makes polar molecules, mostly water, rotate in place, and that molecular friction becomes heat. A kitchen microwave oven works exactly this way. So does medical diathermy. Our knowledge base describes dielectric heating as the established route by which radiofrequency energy warms living tissue. Nobody disputes any part of that, and nobody needs to, which is worth dwelling on because it cuts both ways. The same mechanism that could in principle be weaponized sits in ordinary kitchens, hospital physiotherapy rooms, food factories, and timber mills. Heating tissue with radio waves has been understood since the 19th century and taught to undergraduates for generations. That a mechanism is real and commonplace tells you nothing whatever about whether it has been aimed at anybody. Ubiquity is not evidence. So what did the 1998 study actually contribute? Not the discovery that electromagnetic energy heats tissue. That was old news by a century. It contributed three things: a target temperature tied to a specific effect, a discussion of the engineering needed to reach that temperature at a distance, and a deliberate framing of the result as a candidate non-lethal weapon. Candidate. That single word is doing an enormous amount of work here. And here the evidence runs out, cleanly and honestly. Reporting on the document found nothing indicating that this whole-body heating method was ever constructed or tested. It was a proposal on paper. A proposal proves that somebody thought about it and costed it out. It does not prove a device existed, and it certainly does not prove one was ever pointed at anybody. Hold that line firmly because everything after this depends on it. The obstacles are severe. Raising a human core temperature by several degrees demands either enormous power or a long, steady exposure, and holding it there without tipping into dangerous hyperthermia demands precise feedback control that grows harder with every meter of distance. Yet the military did field a related heating weapon openly mounted on a truck. Next, the active denial system, the open, acknowledged cousin, and the honest benchmark against which every covert claim must be measured. So the 1998 report described whole-body heating that, on the public record, was never built or tested. That could be where the story ends. It is not, because in the years that followed, the United States military openly developed, publicly demonstrated, and briefly deployed a directed energy heating weapon of its own. Not in secret, on camera in front of reporters. It is called the active denial system, and it is this chapter's honest benchmark. The active denial system is a millimeter wave emitter, developed by the United States Air Force Research Laboratory with the Defense Department's Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate. It transmits at roughly 95 gigahertz, far above the microwave bands the 1998 report discussed. This is not a rumor, not a patent, not a piece of testimony. It is an acknowledged, funded, photographed weapon system, and the Air Force has said so in public for more than 20 years. The beam penetrates skin to a depth of about 0.4 of a millimeter, roughly 1/64 of an inch. That shallowness is the entire design. The energy stops in the outer layer, where the pain receptors live, rather than reaching deeper tissue or organs. What it produces is an intense, involuntary sensation of heat that makes a person step away, without, in principle, causing lasting injury. Nothing here is exotic physics. Reporters who volunteered to stand in the beam reached over and over for the same comparison. Opening an oven door. A wall of heat arriving instantly across every patch of exposed skin, with no visible source and no way to argue with it. The reflex is to step back, and stepping back is precisely the point. This is a device engineered to move a crowd, not to wound it. That distinction was the selling point. The system was shown to the press more than once during the 2000s. The most widely cited demonstration came in 2007, at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia, where reporters were allowed to feel the beam and to film the hardware in operation. That matters enormously for this chapter. We are not arguing about whether the effect exists. We can watch it, measure it, and name the agencies that built it. The public timeline is short and checkable. The knowledge base entry on Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico records that the system was developed in part there and publicly unveiled in 2001. Press demonstrations followed through the decade. In 2010 it went to Afghanistan for field evaluation, and was reportedly withdrawn without ever being used. For dates, one weapon and not a single classified document required. Now look at what the acknowledged system actually needs. A truck. A dish antenna roughly 2 meters across. A generator big enough to feed it and a cooling plant to carry the waste heat away. And clear line of sight to a person standing in the open. None of that is an accident of early engineering. It is what the physics of a 95 GHz beam demands if you want it to work at range. Set the two columns side by side and the distance between them becomes visible. On the left, what the Air Force has shown the world. On the right, what covert directed energy targeting would have to involve. Smaller, quieter, hidden power, through walls, against someone who never knew a beam was pointed anywhere. Physics does not forbid that column outright, but nothing in the open record contains it, and that is the honest position. In 2010, the system reached Afghanistan for field evaluation, and it came home without being fired in anger. Why is disputed? Some accounts point to operational limits. Weather, power, the sheer bulk of the platform. Others point to a political calculation that a heat ray, however non-lethal by design, would be read around the world as an instrument of torture. Both readings are inference. The deployment itself is documented. Hold on to one number because it disciplines everything that follows. 0.4 of a millimeter. That is how far the acknowledged beam reaches into a human body. It does not read thoughts. It does not deliver words. It does not touch the brain, the heart, or the nervous system. It heats the outer surface of skin until the person moves. Whatever else directed energy might do, this particular system does one thing. So the active denial system becomes our yardstick. Any claim that a related technology is being used covertly against a private individual must be measured against that truck. Shrunk to fit a vehicle. Running without a visible power plant. Aimed through a wall. Fired at someone who never knew a demonstration was scheduled. That may be possible because classified capability can exceed the acknowledged kind. It is simply not established by the public record. The knowledge base is candid about how this system functions inside targeted individual literature. It is cited as proof of concept, evidence that the category is real and therefore that hidden versions are conceivable. Hold that against a second rule. A patent proves somebody filed a document, not that a device was built, and never that one was fielded. Proof of concept is not proof of deployment. The category exists. Covert use does not follow. A reality check in plain terms. A beam spreads as it travels, and the smaller the aperture, the faster it spreads. That is exactly why the acknowledged emitter carries a dish 2 meters wide. Power falls steeply with distance. Masonry, metal, water, even heavy rain absorb and scatter millimeter waves. Every one of those constraints applies to a concealed device precisely as it applies to a truck. Concealment does not repeal them. There is a second family in this arsenal, and its physics is better understood than anything in the electromagnetic column. Sound. The mind weapon taxonomy includes acoustic and ultrasonic entries, and they deserve a careful look precisely because so much of the underlying science is settled, routine, and clinical. Above the range of human hearing lies ultrasound. Below it lies infrasound. Both have been proposed as weapons. Both hit the same wall. Ultrasound means acoustic energy above roughly 20 kHz, the ceiling of human hearing. Its effects on tissue are not in dispute anywhere. It images a fetus. It heats muscle in physiotherapy. Focused tightly at high intensity, it destroys tissue outright. Tumors, uterine fibroids, and in neurosurgery, very small volumes of brain tissue to calm essential tremor. The effects are real, the physics is understood, and the clinical applications are completely routine. High-intensity focused ultrasound is the strongest form of that idea in medicine. Many beams converge on a single point deep inside the body, so that only where they meet does the energy turn destructive. It works. It is approved. And it requires a patient lying still in physical contact with the machine, often inside a scanner, for a procedure measured in hours. That contact requirement is not a footnote. It is the whole problem. Here is why that coupling gel exists at all. Sound crossing from a transducer into air, and then from air into skin, meets an enormous mismatch in acoustic impedance. Most of the energy simply bounces back at each boundary, and whatever does enter the air is absorbed fast. The gel deletes the air gap. A covert, long-range ultrasound weapon would have to defeat that mismatch, and no public evidence shows anybody has. Infrasound is the mirror image, acoustic energy below roughly 20 Hz, beneath the floor of hearing. Earthquakes make it. So do ocean waves, ventilation plants, and heavy industrial machinery. At very high intensity, well above 120 decibels and close to the pain threshold, it has been reported to produce pressure, vibration, anxiety, and in some accounts nausea and disorientation. The mechanism is not neural. It is mechanical and it is blunt. The body resonates. Low-frequency pressure waves couple into the chest, the abdomen, the sinuses, and the balance organs of the inner ear, and the brain reads that as threat or disequilibrium. Reports from the 1960s and 70s describe French, Soviet, and American programs chasing the effect. Results, where published, were mixed. The knowledge base dates documented infrasound weapons research to at least the 1970s, and calls the field largely unverified. And that is where infrasound collapses as a targeting weapon. To shake a human body, you need a source the size of a small building, and low-frequency sound radiates in every direction at once. You cannot aim it at one person on a street without reaching everyone else on that street. Next, two systems that make no attempt to hide at all. The long-range acoustic hailer and the laser dazzler. Both are real. Both are fielded. So the acoustic route runs into the same wall as the electromagnetic one. Distance. But step outside the 1998 report for a moment, because two directed energy systems in this broad family are not contested at all. They are cataloged, procured, photographed, and filmed. You can watch them work on the evening news. They matter here for one reason. They show us exactly what such systems currently cost in size, power, and visibility. The first is the long-range acoustic device, the LRAD. Strip away the branding and it is a loudspeaker that focuses sound into a narrow beam instead of scattering it in every direction. It was built by the LRAD Corporation, now trading as Genesis, after the year 2000 attack on the USS Cole. The need was specific and naval. Let a warship warn off an approaching small boat without opening fire. An ordinary speaker wastes most of its energy sideways. An LRAD uses an array of small emitters, phased so their output reinforces along one axis and cancels off it. The result is a cone rather than a sphere. Close in, the sound is physically painful. Further out, it stays intelligible far longer than a normal hailer. But the cone widens with distance. It is directional. It is not surgical. Hold that distinction. These are fielded systems, not proposals. LRADs have been mounted on United States Navy vessels, carried by police forces for crowd control, and used across a range of military and security settings. They come in every size, from a unit one person can hold to a vehicle-mounted array. Note what that tells you. The capability scales with the hardware, and the hardware is large, powered, visible, and, in most places, entirely purchasable. Every acoustic device carries the same three limits. Sound needs line of sight because it does not pass usefully through walls. The beam spreads so precision falls away with range. And it is audible by definition. A person inside an LRAD beam knows immediately that something is being aimed at them, and so does everyone standing near them. That third limit is the one worth holding onto for the rest of this chapter. Here is the reality check. Every acknowledged acoustic weapon on the planet is loud, obvious, and attributable. It announces itself. If somebody wanted a covert harassment tool, the LRAD would be close to the worst possible starting point, because its entire mechanism depends on being heard. That does not disprove anything targets report. It does mean the fielded acoustic hardware we can actually document is not the thing being described. The second acknowledged system is the laser dazzler. It floods the retina with intense light, usually green or red, at the wavelengths the eye responds to most strongly, so that for a few seconds you simply cannot see in that direction. The design intent is temporary disruption, not injury. Dazzlers are issued equipment in several militaries. They are, again, hardware you can hold in your hand and photograph on a bench. They exist because of a specific operational problem. A vehicle approaches a checkpoint too fast. A boat closes on a warship. The soldier's options used to run from shouting straight to shooting. A dazzler adds a rung on that ladder. Stop the driver seeing without firing a round. Maritime interdiction uses them for the same reason. And once more, the effect is unmistakable. A green light in your eyes is not deniable. Arms control reached this category earlier than most people assume. In 1995, Protocol 4 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the Blinding Laser Protocol banned laser weapons designed to cause permanent blindness. That is 3 years before the Pentagon Bioeffects Study, and 4 years before the European Parliament resolution. Directed energy was already a live subject of binding international law while the research we have been discussing was still being compiled. Be precise about what that protocol does. It bans weapons designed to blind permanently. It does not ban dazzlers, which are built to be temporary, and it says nothing at all about radio frequency or microwave effects on the nervous system. What it establishes is a principle that some uses of directed energy against human beings can be prohibited outright. The principle exists. The specific treaty language for neuroweapons does not. That brings us to the part of this chapter that decides everything else. Not politics, not testimony, but biophysics. Because the gap between what the 1998 study documented and what a covert remote neural weapon would require is not a gap in secrecy or in willingness. It is a gap in engineering, and it can be described in numbers. So here is a short, careful detour into fields and nerve cells. 2 sentences look similar and are not. 1. Electromagnetic energy can affect living tissue. That is trivially true. A microwave oven does it every evening. 2. Electromagnetic energy can manipulate specific neural circuits at a distance without detection. That is an extraordinary engineering claim, and it has not been demonstrated in the open literature. Collapsing those 2 sentences into one is precisely how arguments about this technology go wrong. Your nervous system runs on electrochemistry. A nerve cell holds a voltage across its membrane, and signals travel as that voltage flips, driven by ions moving through protein channels in the membrane wall. An outside electromagnetic field can, in principle, push on that system. Nobody serious disputes it. The whole question is how much field you need at the cell, and what you have to get through in order to deliver it. The mechanism depends on frequency. Down at extremely low frequencies, roughly 0 to 300 Hz, a changing magnetic field induces a weak current in conductive tissue. Faraday's law, the same physics as a transformer. Up in the radio and microwave bands, the dominant effect becomes dielectric heating. Water molecules rotating in the alternating field, shedding energy as heat. Between roughly 100 kHz and 10 MHz, both run together. That middle band is where the most interesting and most contested claims live, and it is also where the trade-off bites hardest. Low frequencies reach deep into the body but resist being focused into a beam, and they carry very little energy. High frequencies focus beautifully and then stop at the skin. You can have depth or you can have precision. Getting both at range through a human skull is the unsolved part. 2 things work against any remote neural claim at the same time. First, the inverse square law. Spread a beam across distance and the power arriving at the target collapses. Second, your own anatomy. The skull and the cerebrospinal fluid around the brain are electrically conductive, so they behave like a partial Faraday cage, attenuating outside electric fields before they ever reach a neuron. The head is a poor antenna, by construction. This is exactly why the active denial system heats skin and does nothing to the brain. At 95 GHz, the beam deposits its energy within about 0.4 of a millimeter of tissue. It is superb at reaching the pain receptors in the outer skin. It is physically incapable of reaching a neuron in the cortex. The very property that lets you aim it precisely is the property that stops it at the surface. There is one technology that genuinely reaches deep brain structures without cutting: focused ultrasound. It is used clinically to lesion tiny targets in essential tremor and to open the blood-brain barrier temporarily. Proof, then, that deep targeting is possible. But read the setup carefully. The transducer touches the head or sits in a coupling medium of water or gel. Through open air, almost all of that acoustic energy simply bounces off the skin. So name the problems rather than hand-waving past them. Skull and fluid attenuation, focusing at depth, beam divergence over range, heat dumped into everything the beam crosses on the way through, the impedance mismatch between air and tissue, power supply and cooling, line of sight, and telling one head from another in a crowd. Each of these is a real, identified engineering obstacle, and none of them has a published solution in the open literature today. None of that says remote neural manipulation is impossible. Physics forbids perpetual motion and faster-than-light travel. It does not forbid this. These are engineering problems, and engineering problems do get solved, sometimes quietly, in places the public never sees. But they remain problems, and an honest account names them. Which leaves the harder question, and the one we take up next. What does the 1998 report actually establish? Naming those engineering problems is only half of an honest evaluation. The other half is stating, plainly and without hedging, what is already settled, because documented ground is the only thing a serious investigation can stand on. So let us lay that floor down. 4 claims in the 1998 Army bioeffects study are not contested, not community folklore, and not hard to check. Any researcher with a library card can verify every one. The file has an address. It was produced in February 1998 by researchers working under the United States Department of the Army in coordination with Air Force Non-Lethal Weapons Research. Its title is deliberately flat: Bioeffects of Selected Non-Lethal Weapons. It stayed classified for 8 years and reached the public in December 2006 only because one private citizen filed a Freedom of Information Act request and refused to give up. So here is the ledger. Microwave hearing is real. High-field electromagnetic pulses can trigger nerve cells to fire. Directed heating of a human body by electromagnetic energy has been engineered and field-tested. And the research program behind all 3 is publicly funded and openly documented. Notice what is not on that list. No deployment, no victim, no device in a van. For findings about physics and money, and nothing yet about anybody's life. Take the first one apart. A short microwave pulse is absorbed by the water-rich tissue of the head. That tissue warms by a microscopic fraction of a degree in millionths of a second, expands, and the expansion launches a pressure wave. The cochlea, which evolved to detect pressure waves in air, detects this one too. The brain reports a click, a buzz, a chirp, inside the head, with no sound in the room. Alan Fry published this in 1962 in the Journal of Applied Physiology, working under a United States Navy contract. Researchers in America, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere replicated it. It is now cited in radiofrequency safety standards and taught in bioelectromagnetics courses, precisely because it is a genuine, non-thermal effect of pulsed RF. The 1998 Army study confirmed and refined it. This is not fringe science. It is textbook science. That matters, and the reason it matters is worth saying carefully. It establishes that a person can hear a sound nobody else hears, from a source nobody else can see, through a mechanism the person has no way to identify. It removes the automatic assumption that such a report must be a hallucination. What it does not do on its own is establish that any particular person's experience was produced that way, in that room on that night. The second finding. According to reporting on the study, electromagnetic pulses around 100 kilovolts per meter, lasting roughly 1 nanosecond, can depolarize nerve membranes and force an action potential by a mechanism distinct from simple heating. Higher fields or repeated exposure push that same mechanism towards seizure activity. Its clinical cousin is transcranial magnetic stimulation, used in neurology every day. Note carefully how that one works. A coil held physically against the scalp. The third finding is the one the military went on to prove in public. Directed electromagnetic heating works. The active denial system, built by the Air Force Research Laboratory with the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate, emits at roughly 95 GHz. The beam penetrates about 0.4 of a millimeter, which is the depth of the skin's pain receptors. Journalists who volunteered to stand in it described the sensation as opening an oven door. This is what the documented capability actually looks like. A truck. A dish antenna roughly 2 meters across. Generators, cooling, and a clear line of sight to somebody standing in the open. Reporters filmed it at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia in 2007. It went to Afghanistan in 2010 for evaluation and was reportedly withdrawn without being used. Large, power-hungry, and unmistakable to the person in the beam. The fourth finding is institutional. This research is not one orphan document. The knowledge base entry on the Naval Postgraduate School records a directed energy bibliography of roughly 200 pages, revised in October 2005, cataloging periodicals, technical reports, and theses. A 2021 master's thesis from that same school is titled, bluntly, Neurowar is Here. The Government of Canada published a directed energy trend card for researchers in 2024. Keep the categories separate. Contracts, catalogs, and proposals prove interest and money. They do not prove a fielded device. The authors quoted here asked for open public debate about these capabilities, and the knowledge base file carrying that line observes that no such debate followed. The same file asserts that in July 1994 the Defense Department proposed using non-lethal weapons beyond declared enemies. That is the document's claim, not a verified finding. None of what we have just listed is contested folklore. It is bioelectromagnetics literature and defense research history, locatable and citable by anybody who wants to look. Which is exactly why the next part has to be said with equal force. A foundation only holds if you know exactly where it ends and the guesswork begins. So here, with the same precision and the same confidence, are the 5 things that the 1998 report does not establish. It names no victim. It describes no operational weapon. It proves no covert targeting of any individual. It supports no claim about extremely low frequency fields and mind control. And it demonstrates neither portability nor covertness. Read that list twice and then read it again, because almost every overreach in this whole field consists of quietly promoting one of those 5 absences into a presence, usually without anybody in the room noticing it has happened. Journalists went through the declassified file when it surfaced. David Hambling covered it for New Scientist, describing research into, in his phrase, using lasers to put voices in people's heads. Sharon Weinberger reported the wider non-lethal program for Wired. Neither found evidence that these effects had by then been miniaturized, built and fielded at the ranges, and with the covertness that targeted individuals' accounts describe. Candidate methods, not built systems. Here is the reality check this whole chapter turns on. A patent proves that somebody filed a description with a patent office and paid a fee. It does not prove a prototype, a purchase, or a deployment. A procurement notice proves a budget line. A feasibility study proves a study. All 3 are genuine evidence of intent. None of them is evidence that a working device exists near anybody's home. So measure the gap honestly. On one side, a truck-mounted emitter with a 2-meter dish, generators and cooling, aimed at a volunteer standing in the open. On the other, the hypothesized version, concealed, portable, effective through walls, invisible to its target, deniable. Between them sit unsolved problems of miniaturization, power management, and beam control. That is not a detail. That is the entire engineering distance, and the public record does not show it crossed. Remember where these effects were observed. Tissue samples, animal models, human volunteers under controlled exposure in laboratories with the equipment bolted to a bench and every parameter logged. Nothing in the report describes an operational scenario against an unwilling person who does not know it is happening. The one system that did emerge from this tradition arrived, as we saw on a truck, and announced itself the instant it was switched on. And distance is the argument that cannot be talked around. The electric field from a source falls away sharply with range. 100 kilovolts per meter at 1 meter becomes roughly 1 kilovolt per meter at 100 meters, a hundredfold loss, at a range most people would still call close. Add beam divergence, aperture size, and the power and cooling that follow, and the hardware grows rather than shrinks. Which brings us to the honest edge of this evidence. The claim that such systems are being used covertly on private individuals is testimony and inference. That is not nothing, and it is not proof. Even sympathetic official work hits the same wall. The knowledge base entry on the European Parliament's STOA report notes its authors could not reach classified military and police files, and that critics called its conclusion speculative. Precision here is not a concession to skeptics. It is armor, a case built on replicated physics, and a documented, funded research program cannot be waved away, unless it is flattened together with claims that carry no support at all. One claim in the mind weapon taxonomy is the weakest link in that entire document, and the likeliest to sink everything around it. Extremely low frequency fields and mind control. Next, we take that claim apart properly. That engineering gap leaves one claim in the taxonomy still unexamined, and it is the weakest of them all. The mind weapon document asserts that extremely low frequency fields, ELF, have been used in mind control. It deserves a closer look precisely because it is fragile. Weak claims and strong claims do not travel well together. Placed side by side, the fragile one drags down the documented physics standing next to it. So begin with the physics. Extremely low frequency means oscillations from roughly 3 to 30 cycles per second. Human brainwaves, delta, theta, alpha, and beta, span roughly half a cycle to 30 cycles per second. The two ranges overlap almost exactly. That coincidence is the whole engine of ELF mind control speculation. If an outside field hums at the same rate as a brain rhythm, perhaps it can capture that rhythm and override it from outside the skull. Two constraints govern what ELF can do, and the first is wavelength. Wavelength is the speed of light divided by frequency, so the slower the oscillation, the longer the wave. At 10 Hz, a typical alpha rhythm, the frequency of relaxed wakefulness, the wavelength runs to about 30,000 kilometers. That is roughly 2.5 times the diameter of the Earth. An efficient radiator has to be a serious fraction of that. Be fair to the idea before dismantling it. Entrainment is not fantasy. Rhythmic stimulation can pull neural oscillations into step, and laboratories have shown it repeatedly using flickering light, pulse sound, and electrodes placed directly on the scalp. The principle holds. What collapses is the delivery. Every demonstrated case involves a stimulus applied close to the subject at known strength under controlled conditions. None of them involve a field beamed at a stranger through a wall. There is a working example, and it is instructive. The United States Navy built an ELF transmitter in Wisconsin to reach submerged submarines. It runs at 76 Hz, wavelength around 4,000 kilometers, and its antenna is 28 miles of cable strung between pylons, grounded at both ends, using the Earth itself as part of the radiating structure. That is the scale the physics demands. It is not a weapon you fit in a van. The second constraint is energy, and it is brutal. A wave's photon energy rises with its frequency, so a single photon at 10 Hz carries roughly 1/10 billionth the energy of a photon from your microwave oven. ELF does not heat tissue and does not break anything. It couples to the body the way a power line couples to a fence wire, by inducing a faint current and nothing more than that. How faint? At the field strengths people actually encounter ambient household levels, and even the occupational exposure of power line workers. The induced currents sit orders of magnitude below the thresholds where documented physiological effects begin. Those thresholds are well characterized: nerve stimulation, muscle activation. Below them, the tissue simply does not respond in any way physics can currently describe. To reach them at a distance with portable equipment is not an engineering problem. It is a wall. Reality check. Nothing said here rules out that someone somewhere has tried to build such a device. Governments have funded stranger things. What the physics rules out is the version usually described: a small, hidden, portable ELF emitter reaching one named person through walls, at a distance and steering their thoughts. That device would need an antenna measured in miles and energies the band cannot carry. The claim is not merely unproven. It is architecturally unlikely. None of which means ELF fields are biologically inert. The bioelectromagnetics literature on this band is substantial and genuinely contested. Some studies report effects on melatonin production, on cell proliferation, on other endpoints, at field strengths far below anything a simple thermal model would predict. Researchers argue about replication, about dose, about whether the effects are artifacts. That argument is live and legitimate. It is also an argument about biology, not about weapons. The furthest the mainstream has gone is this. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies ELF magnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans. Group 2B. The basis is epidemiological, a statistical association between childhood leukemia and living close to high-voltage power lines. Note what that classification is not. Group 2B is a statement about the strength of evidence, not about the size of a risk, and the mechanism remains unknown. Now measure the distance the claim has to travel. It starts with years of low-level residential exposure. It moves to a statistical association with childhood leukemia. It arrives at a cautious classification, meaning the evidence is suggestive. And then it jumps to deliberate, targeted control of one individual's mind. Every step before that jump is documented. The jump itself is supported by nothing in the public record. That is where the evidence runs out. So the verdict on the ELF mind control claim is blunt. It has no support in the public bioelectromagnetics literature, no supporting citation anywhere inside the document that makes it, and no plausible mechanism at field strengths reachable from a distance. The knowledge base records the same critique. Extrapolating from controlled laboratory studies to real-world directed energy weapons is unsupported by evidence. Flattening that claim into the same category as the microwave auditory effect is how a subject gets dismissed. Which brings us to the case that cuts the other way. Because if the ELF claim shows how far a story can outrun its physics, the next one shows the opposite. A set of injuries the United States government investigated at the highest level and could not explain away. It is called Havana Syndrome. It begins in late 2016 at the American Embassy in Cuba, and it has never been closed. The first reports came from personnel at the United States Embassy in Havana. Similar cases followed from China, from Russia, from postings across several continents. Diplomats, intelligence officers, military staff. By 2018, the count stood in the dozens. As reports accumulated, it climbed into the hundreds. These were people with security clearances and professional training, a population not easily dismissed as delusional, attention-seeking, or unreliable witnesses to their own bodies. The symptom pattern was distinctive enough to be recognizable. A sudden onset of loud, directional sound. Witnesses described chirping, buzzing, a grinding noise, accompanied by a sensation of pressure or vibration inside the head. Then the aftermath. Persistent headaches, dizziness, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, the fog people describe when thinking becomes effortful. In some cases, clinicians found damage to the vestibular system, the inner ear structures that govern balance, visible on examination and imaging. And the response was serious, which matters. The State Department ordered a formal investigation. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine convened an expert committee to review the evidence. Multiple intelligence and defense agencies ran their own inquiries. Note the asymmetry with everything else in this chapter. Here the institutions did not tell the affected people to see a psychiatrist. They built committees, funded studies, and treated the reports as a technical problem. In 2020, the National Academies Committee published its finding, and the wording repays attention. Directed pulsed radiofrequency energy was, in its judgment, the most plausible mechanism for the Havana cases. Most plausible. Not confirmed. Not demonstrated. Not attributed. That is a probabilistic verdict, a statement that the evidence points one way more strongly than any alternative. It is careful language, and the care in it is doing real work. Because here is what the investigation did not establish. No device was identified. No perpetrator was named. No mechanism of delivery was demonstrated. The inquiry ran into the same walls that confront every investigation of a covert technical attack. The effects were transient, no projectile or residue was left behind. The sites sat inside countries whose governments controlled access, and the symptoms, though patterned, were not identical from case to case. Lay the dates out and the shape is clear. Late 2016, the first Havana reports. 2018, cases in the dozens spreading beyond Cuba. 2020, the National Academies report. 2021, Congress passes the Havana Act, authorizing compensation for injured personnel. The knowledge base notes what that law does and does not do. It validates the injuries as real, while leaving perpetrators and scope officially unconfirmed. And that is the sobering part. Even with government personnel, security clearances, the national academies, and the intelligence community all engaged, the questions of who did it, with what device, and by what mechanism remain unanswered. Hold that beside a private citizen reporting the same symptoms with no clearance, no institution, no committee. The gap is narrower than it was, but it is still there. Next, we lay 60 years of that record end to end. If the United States could not name the device that injured its own diplomats, the private citizen has no chance of naming one either. So set that question aside for a moment and do something simpler. Lay the documented dates end to end, from the first laboratory paper to the most recent government report, and see what the sequence itself says. 60 years of record, arranged in order, tells a story no single item tells alone. For entries open the record, and no two are the same kind of document. A peer-reviewed physiology paper in 1962, a binding arms control protocol in 1995, a classified defense study in 1998, a parliamentary resolution in 1999, a journal, a treaty, a laboratory, and a legislature. Whatever else is disputed here, the subject was never confined to internet forums. It was in the literature and in the law from the start. 1962. Alan Fry, working with United States Navy funding, publishes in the Journal of Applied Physiology the first description of what became the Fry effect. Pulsed radiofrequency energy, aimed at the head, is perceived as clicking or buzzing that has no external sound. It is documented, it is replicated, and it is understood. The pulse heats tissue a fraction of a degree, and that tiny expansion makes a pressure wave the inner ear reads as sound. 1995. States adopt Protocol 4 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, banning laser weapons designed to cause permanent blindness. Notice what that means. Governments did not merely admit that a directed energy weapon could be built. They agreed in advance to outlaw one before it was widely fielded. That is the legal precedent. This category is a legitimate subject of arms control law and has been for 30 years. A ban, though, is not a deployment. 1998. United States Army researchers compile bioeffects of selected non-lethal weapons, surveying microwave hearing, electromagnetic effects on nerve tissue, and directed heating of the body as candidate non-lethal mechanisms. Then it is classified and stays classified for 8 years. Hold two thoughts at once. The document proves that the effects were seriously studied with public money. It does not prove that any weapon described in it was ever built, tested on anyone, or fielded. 28th of January, 1999. The European Parliament, sitting in plenary, adopts Resolution A4/0005, calling for an international convention. The text names the brain specifically, its chemical, electrical, and sound vibration functioning. Read that carefully. A parliament of 15 member states put the manipulation of human beings by weapons onto the arms control agenda. Called for a ban. No such convention was ever negotiated, and the resolution itself binds nobody. A resolution is a statement of position, not a law. It creates no offense, funds no inspectorate, and compels no member state. That distinction matters more than any quotation from it. What the resolution does prove is institutional attention. 10 years later, the knowledge base records a campaign group addressing the 5th European Symposium on Non-Lethal Weapons at Ettlingen in Germany on the social implications of these systems. Tension, then, not enforcement. 2001. Representative Denis Kucinich introduces the Space Preservation Act, House Bill 2977. Its original text lists psychotronic and mind control devices among the space-based weapons it would prohibit. That language is often quoted as an admission. It is not. A bill is a proposal by one legislator. This one never became law, and the exotic weapons language was stripped from the later revision. What it proves is that the words entered the congressional record. Now the clearest case in the chapter. A directed energy weapon that demonstrably exists. The active denial system, built for the United States military, mounts a millimeter wave emitter on a truck. Point it at people and they feel intense heat on the skin within seconds and move. In 2007, the Air Force demonstrated it to the press, and journalists volunteered to stand in the beam. Their published accounts are the public record. 95 gigahertz. At that frequency, the waves stop in the outermost 0.4 of a millimeter of skin, which is why the sensation is fierce and the injury usually is not. It also explains the limits. Millimeter waves need line of sight. Walls stop them. Rain and heavy clothing weaken them. And the emitter is a dish roughly 2 meters across on a heavy vehicle, drawing generator scale power. This is not something concealed in a passing car. December 2006. The 1998 bioeffects study is declassified in response to a Freedom of Information request, and reporters read it. David Hambling covered it for New Scientist. Sharon Weinberger covered it for Wired. Note how the document reached the public. Not through a leak, not through a whistleblower, but through a records request any citizen may file. That is worth remembering the next time someone says nothing can ever be proved. From 2016, American diplomats and intelligence officers in Havana report headaches, dizziness, cognitive trouble, and lasting balance damage, often after a directional sound or pressure. Similar reports follow from China, Russia, and elsewhere. In 2020, the National Academies of Sciences judge-directed pulsed radiofrequency energy the most plausible mechanism, while stating plainly that no device and no perpetrator had been identified. Most plausible is a judgment, not an identification. Everything on this timeline falls into one of three tiers, and the whole discipline of the chapter is refusing to let them merge. Tier 1. Demonstrated and fielded hardware, named, dated, photographed. Tier 2. Studies, patents, bills, and procurement papers, which prove that someone filed, funded, or proposed something and nothing more. Tier 3. The claim that such systems are used covertly on private individuals. That third tier is testimony and inference. It is not documentation. So what does the whole arc prove? Not that anyone is being targeted. Read it honestly and it proves something quieter and sturdier. The knowledge base's Bradford Non-Lethal Weapons Project traces military work on directed energy systems back to the late 1980s, following impact projectiles developed for crowd control decades earlier. This subject was not invented by targeted individuals. It was invented, funded, and argued over inside defense ministries, and much of that argument happened in public. Which brings the chapter to its hardest question, and it is addressed to the person watching who believes they are living through exactly this. Why does any of that careful line drawing matter to you? Why insist on the difference between the Fry effect and the mind control claim, between the active denial system and its hypothetical covert cousin? The answer is the spine of this section. Precision is not dismissal. Precision is protection, and it works on three levels. Consider two accounts of the same experience. The first says, I have effects consistent with documented microwave hearing and heating research, and I cannot confirm the mechanism, the actor, or the device. The second says, a named agency is attacking me from a van, using satellites and neural mapping to control my mind. Both may be spoken by the same honest person. Only the first is scoped to what that person can personally verify, and that difference decides everything. At the practical level, a scoped account is simply harder to wave away. TI1 Voice at 1.witisk.org scores attack documentation on an evidence quality scale from 0 to 10, weighting corroboration, completeness, how soon the report was made, and how well it cross-references other cases. Notice what that rewards. Not certainty about the weapon, density of verifiable detail. And the one claim you cannot support can cost you every detail you can. Here is the mechanism this section exists to defeat. Journalists, clinicians, and investigators are trained to find the single overreaching claim that lets them dismiss an entire account. Present the testimony as one undifferentiated block, and the weakest piece decides the fate of the strongest. Separate the layers, and that trick stops working. A skeptic cannot discredit 60 years of documented physics by attacking a speculative sentence, because the two are no longer bolted together. The second level is psychological, and it is the gentlest thing this chapter has to say. A person who can hold the sentence something is happening to my body. I do not know how, and I need help finding out keeps the door open to discovery, to help, to an explanation nobody has thought of yet. Certainty closes that door. Feels like relief because it replaces terror with a story. Then it becomes a trap. The third level is strategic. The community's one real asset is its credibility, and every claim that outruns the evidence spends a little of it. Across thousands of posts, that spending compounds until serious investigators stop coming. The knowledge base's own declaration is blunt about the limits. It does not guarantee that anyone will believe you. What it can do is make the record precise. And precision starts with how you read a military document. Precision, then, is not a concession to the skeptic. It is armor. And one more piece of that armor has to be fitted before this chapter closes its case. The discipline of reading a military research document for what it actually says. Because the 1998 Pentagon study, and every document like it, was written inside an institution for institutional reasons. Read it without knowing those reasons, and it will tell you things it never said. Defense research documents are produced to do jobs. They justify budgets. They advocate for programs. They assess technical options for the people deciding where money goes. That purpose shapes every sentence. The knowledge base holds a clear example. A 2004 Heritage Foundation paper urging directed energy weapons for critical infrastructure, citing a trade headline promising low cost per kill. That is not deception. It is advocacy, and it reads very differently from a laboratory result. Watch what happens inside a single phrase. When a military researcher writes that an effect could be used for a non-lethal weapon, that sentence is doing two jobs at once. It is a claim about physics. The effect is possible. It is also a bid for funding. The researcher wants to explore it. Conflating the two, treating we could develop this as we have developed this, is the commonest error in technology conspiracy writing. So sort every sentence into one of three trays. Tray 1 demonstrated, an effect actually observed in an experiment with numbers attached. Tray 2 research goal, an effect the authors believe could be achieved with further work. Tray 3 design possibility, an effect that might in principle follow from the underlying physics, but which nobody has demonstrated and nobody has even set out to build. One document routinely contains all three. Sort the 1998 study that way and it comes apart cleanly. Microwave hearing, demonstrated both in the earlier literature the report reviews and in the work it describes itself. Electromagnetic neural effects, demonstrated in tissue and animal models, with specific field strength and pulse duration figures given. Directed body heating for disorientation, a candidate method, a design goal, not a demonstrated weapon. 3 findings, 3 different evidentiary weights, 1 cover page. That third item deserves a sentence of its own. The study discusses heating a body to roughly 41 degrees Celsius to produce disorientation. 41 degrees is real physics. It is a dangerous fever, and fever does impair thinking. But the document describes it as a method worth pursuing, and no later public record shows such a device was ever built. A goal stated in 1998 is not hardware. Here the evidence stops. There are 2 ways to misread that page, and they are mirror images of each other. The first inflates, the Pentagon has a microwave hearing weapon, a neural weapon, and a heating weapon. It does not follow, and it collapses the moment a skeptic checks. The second dismisses. None of this is real, it is all a wish list. That throws away demonstrated physics because it shares a binding with speculation. Both are lazy reading. Here is the reality check this chapter keeps returning to. A document is not a verdict. You do not accept it whole and you do not reject it whole. You read each claim inside it on its own evidentiary merits, and you say out loud which tray that claim landed in. Do that consistently and something useful happens. Your strongest evidence stops being held hostage by your weakest and least guarded sentence. And there is far more to read than one report. The knowledge base holds a directed energy bibliography compiled by G. E. Marlatt, listing hundreds of articles from Scientific American, Aviation Week, and Naval Forces going back to the 1980s. Set that beside a much-quoted excerpt from a 1994 Memorandum of Understanding, circulating on forums with no full document attached. One of those you can go and check. The other you cannot. So put the pieces on the table and sort them, which is the only honest way to close a chapter like this one. There are 4. A taxonomy of mechanisms. A verified corner where the research is real and public. An unverified remainder that the wider claim stacks on top. And one open question that neither side of this argument gets to close. Take them in order and refuse to blur them. Piece A is the taxonomy itself. 7 named mechanisms, from extremely low frequency fields at the bottom to pulsed microwaves at the top, spanning roughly 9 orders of magnitude of frequency. Every one is a real physical phenomenon. Low frequency fields do induce weak currents in tissue. Ultrasound does propagate as pressure waves. Microwaves do heat tissue. The taxonomy is a useful inventory, provided each entry is judged alone rather than as a block. Piece B is the verified corner. The 1998 United States Army Bioeffects Report was not leaked, and it was not invented by this community. It was declassified in December 2006, in answer to a private citizen's Freedom of Information request, and then reported by journalists at New Scientist and Wired. The knowledge base tracks that provenance. This is defense research history, sitting in the public record, available to anyone. Inside that corner sit 3 genuine research subjects. Microwave hearing, published, replicated, studied since 1962, with an understood mechanism. High-field nanosecond electromagnetic pulses, capable of triggering neural firing at sufficient intensity, demonstrated in tissue and animal work. And directed body heating, which has a real military cousin that was actually built. These effects are real, they were studied with public money, and they were considered promising for weapons development. That much is not in dispute. That cousin is the active denial system, and it is the most useful object in this chapter because it is documented end to end. A millimeter wave emitter at 95 GHz, penetrating about 0.4 of a millimeter into skin, producing intense heat without lasting injury in published trials. It works, and it was publicly demonstrated. It also needs a dish, a generator, and a heavy vehicle to carry them. Fielded reality has a size. Piece C is everything the wider claim stacks on top of that, and it is where the public record runs out. Covert deployment against named individuals. Portable, long-range hardware reaching through walls. Sustained targeting of one person across years. Specific mind-controlling roles assigned to extremely low-frequency fields and to harmonics. Much of the targeted individual literature asserts these things, and many targets sincerely believe them. They are not, on current evidence, established. Say the distinction plainly because everything in this chapter rests on it. The active denial system exists, a fielded system named, funded, demonstrated with a year attached. A patent, a procurement notice, or a research proposal proves a filing, not a working device. And a claim that such a system was used covertly against one particular person is testimony and inference. 3 categories. The gap between the first and the third is the entire problem. Piece D is the open question, and its name is Havana Syndrome. From 2016 onward, American diplomatic and intelligence personnel reported headaches, dizziness, cognitive difficulty, and lasting vestibular damage, often alongside a sense of directional sound or pressure. Governments investigated. The national academies were asked what could physically account for it. Whatever else that episode shows, it shows officials treating directed energy against individuals as a question worth investigating seriously. The wording of that 2020 conclusion matters, so listen to what it does not say. It names a mechanism as the most plausible one. It does not name a device, and it does not name a perpetrator, because the investigators could identify neither. That is what a careful finding looks like when the physics is suggestive and the attribution is missing. Plausible mechanism, unknown source. Nothing more and nothing less. So the gap between studied in a laboratory and happening to real people has, in one officially investigated set of cases, been partly bridged. That is not proof that the same mechanism explains most targeted individual reports. It narrows a distance, no more. The knowledge base is blunt about what narrows it further. Structured documentation, scored for corroboration and completeness, rather than personal event logs, which carry no recognized evidentiary weight in court. Which leaves the question genuinely open, not proven, not closed, open. And if one piece of this arsenal is going to carry the weight of a serious case, it is the oldest and best documented of them all, microwave hearing. So the next stretch of this chapter does what the literature rarely bothers to do. It goes back to Alan Frey's original papers, the Navy-funded work of 1961 and 1962. That open question sends us back to the beginning. Almost every claim about voices, clicks, and beams rests, somewhere in its foundations, on one body of research from the early 1960s. It is cited constantly and read almost never. So this section does something unusual in this literature. It goes back to the original papers of Alan Fry and asks a narrow question. What did he actually demonstrate, and what did he merely raise? Start with a correction the community rarely makes. Frey's first major publication was not the famous 1962 paper. It was a technical report a year earlier, in 1961, written for General Electric's Advanced Electronics Center at Cornell University and funded under a contract with the United States Navy. Its title was plain: Auditory System Response to Radio Frequency Energy. The subjects were, for the most part, Fry himself and his colleagues. What those subjects reported is worth hearing precisely. With their heads exposed to pulsed radiofrequency energy at frequencies around 1.3 gigahertz, they perceived sound, not speech. Buzzing, clicking, hissing, knocking, and which of those they heard depended on the shape of the pulse. One detail matters more than the rest. The sound seemed to come from the side of the head the source was illuminating. Move the beam and the perception moved with it. The mechanism Fry proposed in 1962 is still the accepted explanation, and it is almost disappointingly ordinary. A pulse of microwave energy is absorbed by tissue. The tissue warms by a minuscule amount, but very fast. Fast warming means expansion. Expansion means a pressure wave, and that wave travels through the skull to the inner ear. The cochlea does what cochleas do. Here's a click. No receiver, no implant, no mystery. The 1962 paper in the Journal of Applied Physiology was the first peer-reviewed description of the effect. Its most elegant result was a control. People with conductive hearing loss, damage in the pathway that carries airborne sound, could still perceive the radiofrequency sounds. But a functioning cochlea was required. That combination rules out imagination and rules out ordinary hearing. It establishes a genuine auditory phenomenon with a physical cause, which is why the effect survived. Here is the double edge of that success. The knowledge base records the critic's summary bluntly, and it is fair. Open publication and independent replication are exactly what a serious finding looks like. They are also, on their own, no evidence at all of a weapon. Advocates answer that unclassified foundations do not rule out classified development afterwards. Both statements are true. Neither settles anything. That is the shape of this entire chapter. Fry was not left alone with the result. Through the 1960s and 70s, laboratories at the University of Washington, at the Naval Medical Research Institute and elsewhere took the effect apart. They reproduced it across a wide band, from roughly 200 megahertz to 6.5 gigahertz. They showed that pulse width, repetition rate, and power determine what the subject hears. That is independent replication, the strongest thing this chapter says about anything. And the power required is low. The threshold for perceiving the effect sits at peak power densities on the order of milliwatts per square centimeter, far below the levels that heat tissue enough to injure it. That number does two jobs at once. It removes the objection that any such effect would need a visible, cooking hot beam. It also explains why the Fry effect keeps reappearing in weapons discussions decades after 1962. Reality check. Everything just described happened with a subject seated in front of a known source at a known distance with no walls in the way and the equipment tuned by the people running the experiment. Producing the effect in that room is a solved problem. Delivering it to one named person, through a building at range repeatedly for years without them detecting the source, is a different and far harder engineering problem. The two are constantly confused. Now the step that everything else in this series hangs on. Some researchers reported that with sophisticated modulation, using the pulses to carry an audio signal, the perceived sound could be made to approach intelligible speech. Note the verbs reported, could be made. That finding has been contested, and to this chapter's knowledge, it has not been replicated independently in the peer-reviewed literature. Clicks are established. Words are not. Hold that line. Two documents get cited, and both need careful handling. United States Patent Number 6470214 describes a method for implementing the radiofrequency hearing effect. The knowledge base notes it builds on the 1960s and 70s research, and that its operational deployment remains unconfirmed. Patent proves a filing. It does not prove a device was built, tested, or fielded. The Freedom of Information Act glossary entry is a definition, not a deployment. Fry did not stop at hearing. His later work ran into the blood-brain barrier, into behavior in animal models, and into how cell membranes function. Two papers are still cited, Neural Function and Behavior, from 1975, and Biological Effects of Microwaves, Thermal and Athermal, from 1980. That second title is the hinge of the next section. It also made him a polarizing figure, because he was willing to speculate about weapons applications of his own findings. So the Fry research settles three things, and only three. 1. The microwave auditory effect is real, its mechanism is understood, and independent groups have reproduced it. 2. It does not need extraordinary power, though getting that power onto one person, at distance, through walls unnoticed, is a much harder problem than producing it on a bench. 3. Speech transmission has been raised in the literature since the 70s, but the evidence it was achieved is thin. That word from Frey's 1980 title, athermal, opens the argument that structures this whole field. Everything you have heard about directed energy weapons depends on an unresolved scientific dispute about how electromagnetic energy touches living tissue. It has shaped research funding, safety regulation, and litigation for 50 years. Both camps have serious arguments. This section sets them out without picking a winner, because the field itself has not picked one. The thermal paradigm is the mainstream position. It holds that the one well-established way electromagnetic fields affect tissue is by heating it. Raise the temperature far enough and you get burns, protein damage, cell death. Every major exposure standard is built on that assumption. The Federal Communications Commission's phone limits, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Guidelines, the International Commission on Non-Ionicing Radiation Protection's recommendations, all aim at preventing a temperature rise. 1 degree Celsius. That is the number under every radiofrequency safety limit in the world. A whole body temperature rise of 1 degree, with higher allowances for localized exposure to hands and limbs. Everything below that line is, under the strict thermal view, not an effect at all. Reports from below the threshold get explained as measurement error, statistical artifact, or the influence of stress, expectation, and pre-existing conditions. It is tidy and it has one hole. The hole is the Fry effect itself. It happens at power far below the heating threshold, by a mechanism that is technically not bulk heating at all. The mainstream position cannot account for its own most replicated finding. The knowledge base notes that the Catania resolution, signed by working scientists, formally contested the thermal-only paradigm of electromagnetic field safety. That is not fringe advocacy. That is a dispute inside the discipline about what counts as a mechanism. So what does the other camp actually propose? Direct interaction with ion channels in cell membranes, which could alter neural firing without warming anything. Effects on reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. Changes in the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, Frey's own later territory. Suppressed melatonin, reported in some epidemiological studies of extremely low-frequency exposure. And effects on cell signaling and gene expression through routes nobody has fully mapped. Now see why this matters to a target's account. If only thermal effects are real, the possible weapons are limited, the active denial system and directed heating. The knowledge base records an Oak Ridge proposal for a thermal gun raising body temperature to 107 degrees Fahrenheit, which never left the proposal stage. Under that view, neural manipulation and subliminal speech are implausible. If non-thermal effects are real and can be weaponized, they are merely unproven. That is where honesty leaves us. The non-thermal camp explains more but proves less. Its literature is contested, hard to replicate, and open to charges of weak method. The thermal camp is rigorous and incomplete. A responsible reading refuses to pick a side prematurely, because the science has not picked one. Which raises the question the next section takes up. What does law do with a weapon category the scientists cannot yet agree about? That argument, thermal against non-thermal, is unresolved in the laboratory, and it will stay unresolved for some time. A second question sits beside it, and its answer is far shorter. Suppose the effects are real, and suppose they can be engineered. What law governs them? Who inspects? Who investigates a complaint from a private citizen? Turn from physics to statute, and the international shelf is very nearly bare. That emptiness is our subject now. Recall the date. On the 28th of January 1999, the European Parliament adopted a resolution calling for an international convention banning weapons that might enable any form of manipulation of human beings. That was a call, not a law. A resolution binds nobody. 27 years later, no such convention exists. No treaty, no protocol, no draft text formally tabled. The Parliament named the danger, and the machinery never followed it. Set the categories side by side. Chemical weapons have a convention in force since 1997, with its own implementing organization. Biological weapons have one from 1975. Blinding lasers were banned by Protocol 4 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in 1995. Brain manipulation weapons, neurotechnology applications, directed energy bioeffects. Nothing. Not a weak treaty, not a disputed one. No instrument at all, which is a different kind of silence. The forum where such a treaty would be born does exist. The Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the same framework that produced the Blinding Laser Protocol, holds review conferences and meetings of experts in Geneva, and it has periodically taken up emerging technologies, including directed energy and neurotechnology. Note carefully what that forum is. It is a place where states may raise a concern. It is not a body that investigates one. Lay the arms control record end to end, and the shape of it is plain. Biological weapons, 1975. Blinding lasers, 1995. The first binding rule aimed squarely at a directed energy weapon. Chemical weapons, 1997. Then the European Parliament's call in 1999, and after that, on this particular category, nothing at all. As of this writing, no protocol on brain manipulation weapons has been adopted, or even formally proposed for negotiation. Why nothing? Partly because of how the convention works. Its decisions are taken by consensus, which means a single state with an interest in a technology can hold a text where it stands indefinitely without ever casting a public vote against it. The Blinding Laser Protocol took years of negotiation to clear that bar. It cleared it partly because almost no armed force wanted to be seen deliberately blinding people. Few technologies attract that unanimity. For a live measure of that process, look at autonomous weapons, the systems the press calls killer robots. States have discussed them inside the same convention since the middle 2010s. There have been expert groups, working papers, campaigns, and years of formal sessions. There is still no binding instrument. If a debate that public and that well-attended can stall for over a decade, a quieter category attracts far less urgency. It helps to see what a real ban looks like from the inside. The Chemical Weapons Convention has an implementing organization in The Hague, national declarations, routine inspection of facilities, and a challenge procedure one state can invoke against another. That machinery is what turns a prohibition into something you can actually check. For directed energy and neuromanipulation, there is no declaration, no inspector, and no organization anybody can call. So count the absences precisely, because precision is the whole point. There is no verification regime. There is no inspection mechanism. There is no international body with authority to investigate a claim that neuromanipulative weapons were used. And no treaty obliges any state to disclose its research in this area. Now say the caution in the same breath. An empty shelf proves nothing whatever about whether such weapons exist. That absence is a fact about law. Now put a person inside that vacuum. Someone who believes they are being targeted with these weapons has no international mechanism to petition, no investigative body that can examine their case, and no legal framework under which to seek a remedy. Their testimony may be detailed, consistent, corroborated by hundreds of others, and it still has nowhere to be weighed. That is a gap in the law, not a flaw in the witness. 27 years have passed since that vote in Strasbourg. In that time, the world produced a Havana Syndrome investigation, a National Academies report, an acknowledged millimeter wave weapon, and a compensation statute for injured American personnel. It produced no treaty, no protocol, no inspectorate, and no complaints procedure for this category of technology. The concern kept its institutional standing. It never acquired institutional machinery. Those are two very different things, and recognition is not yet remedy. Where international law is silent, national law has occasionally spoken. The knowledge base records the Havana Act of 2021, a United States statute authorizing payments to personnel with qualifying brain injuries, a law whose very existence concedes that some novel directed energy exposure in peacetime is thinkable. It also records a Russian federal law addressing electromagnetic weapons, national in scope. Two statutes. Neither opens a door for a private citizen. Here is the sentence itself, worth hearing in the Parliament's own words rather than in paraphrase. It asked for a global ban on weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings. Note the verb might enable. This was precaution, not accusation, a legislature acting on a possibility it could not verify. Precaution is a legitimate basis for law. It is not, by itself, evidence of a deployed weapon. That is where the law stands, and it will stand there until states decide otherwise. Now this chapter closes, and closing means drawing in one clean stroke the line it has been drawing all along. Everything examined in this episode falls on one side of that line or the other, and the discipline of this series lives in refusing to let those two sides blur. Take the sorting slowly. It matters more than any fact inside it. Underneath sits a base you can stand on. Phrase peer-reviewed microwave hearing, the 1998 Army bioeffects study, an acknowledged millimeter wave system, the National Academy's 2020 finding on pulsed radiofrequency energy, and 60 years of votes and protocols. On top sits something much larger and, for now, unverified, covert, portable, long-range weapons trained on private individuals. The base is documented. The superstructure is claimed. They are not the same object. Anchor the documented side in hardware with a name and a date attached. The active denial system was built by the Air Force Research Laboratory with the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate, demonstrated to reporters at Moody Air Force Base in 2007, and sent to Afghanistan in 2010, where it was withdrawn without being used. 95 gigahertz. Skin penetration of 0.4 of a millimeter. That system is the honest benchmark. Now the other side, stated as carefully as the first. The claim is that this physics has been engineered into covert weapons used against private individuals for years or decades. That claim is made by many sincere people and is consistent with some documented physics. It is not, on current public evidence, established. And a patent proves that somebody filed a description, never that a device was built, fielded, or used. Reality check using the numbers the sources actually give. The acknowledged system needed a truck, a dish roughly 2 meters across, generators, cooling, and a clear line of sight to someone standing in the open. Millimeter waves are stopped by ordinary building materials. A version small enough for an unmarked van, reaching through a bedroom wall, is hardware nobody has shown publicly. It may exist. It has not been demonstrated. Keep that documented spine in view because it is the part no critic can dismiss. 1962, Fry in a peer-reviewed journal. 1995, a binding protocol on blinding lasers. 1998, an Army bioeffects study, declassified in 2006. 1999, a parliamentary call for a ban. 2007, a public demonstration. 2020, a National Academy's finding. Rejecting that list means rejecting the published record itself. The line, then, is a sorting rather than a verdict, the same sorting Eleanor White modeled and the same one every part of this series attempts. Precision is protection. Not protection from the truth, but protection for it. What remains is the gap itself, and the blunt legal tool that pried the 1998 study loose in the first place. The closing block takes up both, beginning with what we still do not know. So we arrive at the honest ending. This chapter has documented what can be documented. The physics is real. The research was funded. The effects were studied and written up in flat, procedural language. The category was taken seriously by legislators and by treaty bodies across 6 decades. What remains undocumented is narrower, and it is the whole difficulty. That these effects have been engineered into covert weapons and aimed at private individuals. Hold the 2 columns apart one last time. On the left, what the public record establishes. A real Army study from 1998, a fielded millimeter wave system, a peer-reviewed auditory effect, a parliamentary vote, a National Academy's finding. On the right, what it does not establish. A covert, portable weapon deployed against a named private citizen. Both columns are true statements about the world. Neither column reaches across into the other. A reality check with numbers. The active denial system is documented. 95 gigahertz, penetrating skin to about 0.4 of a millimeter, demonstrated to reporters at Moody Air Force Base in 2007. It needed a truck, a dish roughly 2 meters across, generators, cooling, and a clear line of sight to someone standing in the open. That is the acknowledged benchmark. Any covert, through-wall version is a claim beyond it. But notice what the chapter does not say. It does not say the gap is permanent. The history of weapons development is the history of capabilities migrating. From the laboratory to the field, from speculative to operational, from openly discussed to quietly deployed. Radar, the laser, the guided missile all made that journey. So the honest position is not that this could never happen. It is that, today, it is not shown. 2 possibilities remain live, and this chapter takes no position on which is likelier. The first, that capabilities discussed in the 1998 study have, over the decades since, been refined into operational weapons known only to their operators and their targets. The second, that they stayed in the laboratory, too costly, too bulky, too unpredictable to weaponize. The public record, as it stands, does not settle the question in either direction. So hold 4 sentences in mind as you leave. The 1998 Pentagon study is a starting point, not a conclusion. The European Parliament resolution is a precedent, not a finding. The Fry effect is a mechanism, not a weapon. And the testimony of people describing sounds with no source, heat with no fire, and fog with no cause is evidence that something is happening, even where the mechanism stays unknown. Now turn to the mechanism that put this chapter's anchor document into your hands. The 1998 study reached the public because a private citizen filed a Freedom of Information Act request, an ordinary person asking a government to release a paper it had written and then classified. It stayed classified for 8 years and came out in December 2006. No leak, no whistleblower, a form and years of waiting. Be precise about what that tool can do. Freedom of information law can compel release of documents that exist and that the agency admits exist. Alongside whistleblowing and investigative journalism, it is one of the few levers an ordinary citizen holds against official secrecy. The knowledge base notes that this one release let a private person obtain a paper that would otherwise have stayed classified indefinitely. That is a genuine and underrated power. Now the limits named plainly. The law cannot compel release of documents an agency denies holding. It cannot defeat the statutory exemptions, national security, law enforcement, personal privacy, which agencies invoke routinely. It cannot make a government create a document. No explanations, no summaries, no confirmations. And it is slow. A request can take years. An appeal against a refusal can take several more. Every one of those limits bites hardest on the covert. For a person trying to learn whether a directed energy weapon is aimed at them, the tool is indispensable and insufficient at once. Indispensable because it is the only legal lever a private citizen has to demand papers from a government, and because it has delivered real documents before. Insufficient because a government running such a program covertly would classify the file, invoke an exemption, and quite possibly deny that the file exists at all. There is the trap in a single sentence. The very secrecy that would protect a covert program also protects it from disclosure law. Covert programs are, by design, excluded from the record that such requests can reach. So a null answer proves very little. An agency saying it holds no responsive records is not the same as an agency saying no such research was ever done. Absence of file is not absence of fact. Recognizing that limit is not defeatism. It is strategic clarity about where to spend scarce effort. Use disclosure requests to nail down the foundation. The acknowledged research, the funded programs, the demonstrations already on the record. Then build upward with the methods that can reach what requests cannot: whistleblower testimony, patient investigative journalism, litigation discovery, and eventually legislative inquiry, where a committee can put a sworn official under oath and ask directly. Let us gather this episode into one shape. Underneath sits a quarter-century of real, government-funded, occasionally legislated, peer-reviewed research, bioeffects studies, a fielded heating system, a treaty protocol, an academy report. On top sits a much larger and currently unverified claim that this physics has become covert weapons used on private individuals for years. Taking both layers seriously, while refusing to let them merge, is the whole discipline of this chapter. And here is the record itself laid end to end. 1962. Alan Fry publishes The Microwave Auditory Effect in a peer-reviewed journal. 1995. A protocol bans blinding lasers. 1998. The Army bioeffects study is written. 1999. The European Parliament votes for a ban on manipulation weapons. 2006. The study is released. 2020. The National Academies call pulsed radiofrequency energy the most plausible explanation for Havana syndrome. Now the honest ledger of ignorance. We do not know whether any covert, individually targeted directed energy weapon exists. We do not know what device caused the Havana cases, or who operated it. We do not know whether intelligible speech has ever been transmitted by modulated microwave outside a laboratory. We do not know what sits in the classified sections that were withheld. Anyone who tells you otherwise is going beyond the public record. One line from the knowledge base deserves the last word on the argument. In a document called Aerial Mind Control, Not Fiction, the authors of an American defense paper are quoted saying that new military capabilities must be judged acceptable or unacceptable, and that this can only happen through open debate. The knowledge base adds a flat verdict of its own. There has been no open debate. That absence is what this chapter has been circling. Everything in this episode is traceable. The anchor is the 1998 Army Report Bioeffects of Selected Non-Lethal Weapons, released under disclosure law in December 2006. Around it sit phrase papers in the Journal of Applied Physiology, the European Parliament's resolution of January 1999, the National Academy's 2020 report, and reporting by David Hambling and Sharon Weinberger. Supplementary material comes from the TI One Voice knowledge base. Check each one yourself. If this episode helped you sort what you are living through, come and stand with us. TI One Voice is at one.witisk.org, an evidence library, a knowledge base of thousands of documents, a declaration you can sign, and a community wall where nobody has to explain themselves twice. TITV runs around the clock at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TITV. Bring your documentation. Precision is the thing we can build together. Next time on Knowledge Targeting Part 13, the Microwave Auditory Effect, Voices in the Head. We have named the Fry effect a dozen times in this episode. Next, we take it apart properly. The 1961 Navy-funded report, the thermoelastic expansion mechanism, the milliwatt thresholds, and the contested question that hangs over everything, whether pulsed microwave has ever carried intelligible speech or only clicks and buzzing. Bring your questions and join us. Thank you for staying with a difficult 2 hours. This subject rewards patience more than certainty, and you gave it patience. If you are living inside these questions, hold on to the part that is documented. It is more solid than you have been told. Keep your records. Keep your dates. Keep your standards high because they are what will make you impossible to dismiss. We will see you next time.